look for happiness. And everyone thinks, well, I'd rather be happy than miserable, and like, fair enough, you know, but there's nothing about that that has any nobility. And it's not believable. No one believes that, because everyone knows that life is bounded by tragedy and that malevolence abounds. Everyone knows that. So, and you say, you know, so there's that terrible dark dyad of tragedy and evil, and you wave the little flag of happiness in front of it. It's like, you know, no one believes that that will work. But then when you tell people, look, you're dark, you're a monster, you really are. But that's actually useful, because you cannot survive the world without being a monster. People think, oh, well, that's interesting. I kind of suspected that I was a monster, and everyone's always said that that was bad. It is bad, obviously, but there's something that can be done about it, and there's something that can be transmuted into something good without being inhibited. So you're saying, to be good, I don't have to be a neutered tomcat. To be good, I can be a monster, but I can be like a civilized monster. It's like, yeah, that's what you should aim at. You should be unbelievably dangerous. The more dangerous you are, the better. And then you should control that.
Because that's your doctrine on what constitutes morality, right? It's contained capacity for malevolence.
For mayhem.
For mayhem.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and I learned this partly from Jung, but also partly from Nietzsche. And of course, Jung learned it partly from Nietzsche, because Nietzsche pointed out that most of what passes for morality is just obedient cowardice.
Yes.
So I'm an obedient coward. Well, no one wants to think that. So they say, well, no, I'm not an obedient coward. I'm a good person because I don't break any rules. It's like, no, you're not. You're an obedient coward, and you're too afraid to break the rules. That doesn't make you good. It also accounts for why the dark hero, you know, the anti-hero, is so popular in cinematic representations in particular, because people go and watch the mafia hitmen and guys like that, and they, you know, there's a dark part of them that thinks, wow, you know, those guys are really cool. You know, like movies like Quentin Tarantino's movies, you know, where the hitmen are wisecracking and, you know, they're tough and they can handle everything. And you think, well, these guys are psychopathic criminals. Why are people looking up to them? It's because, well, you're not moral if you're just harmless. And the question is, well, what's the antidote to being harmless? And that's the antidote to that is to open up that doorway into the shadow. And then you could become that, right? There's that gleeful, predatory victory that's part of that. You know, that would be associated with, let's say, the attitude that I could have had to what happened with Channel 4. It's like, I won. Yeah. Look the fuck out. Right. But no, that's not right, because it's not good enough. It's better than losing by a lot, because there's nothing in a loss that's admirable. But it's not the highest form of victory. And there's no reason not to go for the highest form of victory. And that's peace. Yeah. Right? It's not predatory victory. It's peace. Because anyone with any sense, who has any wisdom, regards peace as the goal. And that isn't the peace that means that I'm so afraid of you that I'm not going to say anything. It's the peace that is that, like, it's the peace of armed opponents who respect one another. Right, that's real peace.
I guess I'll tell you, too, something about telling the truth. So one thing I did in 1985, 82, 83, 82, I swore that I would stop lying. I said, I'm going to try not to say anything I know to be untrue. You know, that doesn't mean I swore to tell the truth, because truth, that's hard. But you can consciously stop lying when you know you're lying. You can stop doing that. And that has been revolutionary for me. And one of the things I've really realized in recent years, and this is very much worth knowing, is that many times when people speak to each other, they have an agenda in mind. You know, you want something from someone, maybe you want a job, and you want to craft your image to get the job, right? So you say what you need to say to get what you think you need. The problem with that is, what do you know about what you need? You're so accurate about that, are you? And you think you know what you need exactly, and so you're going to falsify your utterances to bring about the desired end. And you're going to use the other person as a target of your manipulation. Well, that's like you write an essay because that's what the professor wants to hear. It's like you don't do that, because you don't falsify your words, because hypothetically they're divine, and the whole stability of the state rests on them, hypothetically, and maybe really too. And so you don't do that. And so instead you strive to tell the truth, and maybe that's an aim too. And then it's an adventure, because I'll tell you one thing, if you tell the truth, you have no idea what's going to happen to you. Because you have to let go of that. It's like, I'm going to say what I think. And then what I'm going to assume, faith, I'm going to assume that whatever happens, if I am telling the truth, is the best thing that could happen. Because the truth brings about what is best. And even if it looks hard for me, because it might be, you know, because people take the easy way out often when they lie, even if it looks bad for me, that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means I don't see the whole picture. And you know, if you believe that the truth will set you free and that there is such a thing as the truth and that the truth is redemptive, then you're pretty much stuck with that conclusion. But one of the remarkable things about that, and this really is worth knowing, is that if you do that, you will have your adventure. Right? That's the Abrahamic adventure, you know? The call from God that justifies your life because of the excitement of what you're doing. And the truth does that. And then, if it's the truth, man, it's your adventure. Because what bloody adventure are you having if you tell someone else's story? It's not yours. And maybe if it's not yours, it's not good enough for you. And then you suffer, and then you're bitter, and then you're cruel, and then you're resentful. That's not good, or you get arrogant. So you break up your life, you know, into practicalities. Your career, your education, your intimate relationship, your marriage, your friendship. Hopefully your intimate relationship and your marriage are the same thing. Your use of time outside work, your civic duty, you know, and you develop an image for yourself, a vision for yourself on all those fronts, and assume that you can have, with the proper sacrifices, what you need and want. And then I'll say something interesting about that, because that's the pursuit of goods in a practical way, right? And what's valuable in a practical way, in an implementable way. And you pick those pathways and you dedicate yourself to their optimization along any of those axes. And then you learn to optimize an aim. And then you see, once you've learned to optimize an aim across a set of goods, you start to aim at what unites those goods. Because that's what makes goods good. It's whatever is common across a set of goods. That's the highest good or a higher good. And so by practicing any good in any rigorous sense and making the proper sacrifices in that direction, you simultaneously learn to approach the good that is the sum or the essence of all those proximal goods. And I would say that the essential insistence in Christianity is that the good that unites all those goods is the same good that's reflected in the image of Christ, which is an image of acceptance of the suffering of life and the necessity of serving the lowest as the highest calling. And that's something, and it might be true, like really, actually, 100% true, more true than anything else, and I actually think it is. If it is true, and if that is real, then why in the world would you ever attempt to do anything else? And it's kind of earth-shattering in some sense to take this with real seriousness, you know. It's all very frightening. If you're not afraid of that vision, you know, and what it implies for you and your soul, then you didn't understand it. But it's also an unbelievably, what would you say, endlessly promising vision of what your life could be. And you know, you might think, well, I need a life so rich that I can justify its suffering. And that's really asking for something, because there's no shortage of suffering in life. And no one thinks their own suffering isn't real. And maybe there's a possibility that there's some aim that's so high that the attempt alone to move in that direction is of sufficient value to act as a panacea for the suffering. And so you could say at the end of your life, oh my God, that was so hard. It was worth it. And so that's the choice you make at the crossroads. If you have any sense, why don't you set your family right? No, you need siblings. Maybe you don't have them. Set your relationship with your parents right. Fix your relationship with your father, with your mother, with your siblings. The same thing. And then what sort of relationship do you want to have with your children? You know, if you could have what you wanted. I had a very good relationship with my children. My daughter, as I said, was very ill, so that made things complicated. But I had a great relationship, and still do, with my son. It's one of the lights of my life. And we concentrated on making that relationship pristine, you know, both of us, and my wife as well. And so you imagine, well, I want my son to love me. I want my son to respect me, and vice versa. I want a child who can make mature decisions. I want someone I can rely on. I want someone who other people gravitate towards. Because I can have what I want if I'm willing to make the proper sacrifices. And so that's a good thing. Could you set your family straight? Well, you need a job or a career. So what can you offer, and what can you bring the world in that regard? And then I would say, well, if you're thinking about career success in this Tower of Babel manner, then that's a temptation. But you might think, well, how much good could I do if I had the opportunity in the shortest possible period of time, if I went all in? And then there's an aim, man, there's an aim. And then you might think, well, what would that look like? You know, if I was a light to my community, if I was a light to the people I work with, who would I be if I was like that? And then you can conceptualize that, and you can see when you deviate from it, and why couldn't you correct for the deviations and move towards that? And then you might say, well, are you going to make productive use of your time outside of work? Productive and generous use of your time? Productive, generous, and meaningful use of your time. How about that? You're going to control your susceptibility to temptation, regulate your alcohol and drug use, because alcoholism takes out lots of people. Regulate your sexual temptation. You can control yourself for some reason that's worth controlling yourself for. You know, because there's something to being sybaritic. There's at least the momentary pleasure. It's not nothing. And you're not going to sacrifice that, if you have any sense, unless you sacrifice it to something clearly better.
You got to aim at something. It's like, otherwise your life is meaningless. Well, what should you aim at? Well, I don't know. Well, pick something. Pick something. Aim at it. As you move toward it, you'll get wiser. Then maybe your aim will change. That's okay. But at least it'll change in an informed way. It's like discipline yourself in one dimension. See what happens. Well, that's exciting. And I think that's something that's open for everyone. You can do that. I shouldn't say that, because I don't believe that. I think you can find yourself in a situation that's so dire that there's no escape from it. But that doesn't matter, because the hero myth might not be, the best we have might not always work. But it's still the best we have. And the fact that it might not work doesn't mean we should throw it away. It's still the best we have. I mean, everyone dies, and so we fail in some sense. The fact that a symphony ends doesn't mean that it wasn't worth listening to. What does the most useful person look like? Well, who is everyone hoping they'll meet? And that's a genuine question. And that's the ideal. The ideal is the person everyone's hoping they'll meet. That's Christ in the Christian culture. Psychologically speaking, independent of any religious claims. So that's this is I suppose the essential idea of the archetype from the Jungian perspective. We have the image of an ideal, and because it is the ultimate ideal, it has a religious element. It's compelling. It's a judge. Why is it a judge? Well, if you fall short of the ideal, your conscience punishes you. So it's a judge. And it's merciful. Well, why? Because if you act out the ideal, then your life improves. You know, and I said, well, the question, what is the relationship between these images of the psyche and reality? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know where the archetype shades into reality. It depends to some degree on how you define reality. And, you know, people don't like that statement. But when you're asking questions that are deep enough, you start to have to ask, what do you mean by true, for example? What do you mean by real? Because the questions you ask get so deep that they're of the same kind as the question, what is real or what is true? You know, think of it this way. Reality is what we adapt to, by definition. That's reasonable. If you're a Darwinian, you have to say that's actually as far as you can go. Reality is that which shapes us. You can't get a better handle on reality than that. Well, when you make a picture of objective reality, it's not the same as that.
It's a different picture. And it's not obvious which one should play trump. Now, the hero myth, as far as I can tell, is an evolutionary artifact. And that means that for human beings, that the hero image is the path of optimal adaptation. Does that reflect reality? Well, it does insofar as reality has selected that. Well, does that mean that reality is a story? Because the hero myth is a story, or at least that's one of the things it is. Does it mean that reality has a narrative aspect? Well, it does insofar as we act things out. Does that mean that reality is ultimately a story? Well, I don't know. But the answer isn't obviously no. Yeah, I mean, in that chapter, that's do not allow yourself to become arrogant, deceitful, or resentful. I might have the order wrong there, but that's the chapter. Yeah, it opens with a discussion of why you would get resentful. It's like, well, culture's arrayed against you, so you're the target of tyrannical forces that are beyond your control. They're arbitrary. They don't work in your interest, at least not entirely. And the more eccentric you are, let's say, the more tyrannical culture will be to you. And so you're stuck with that. And then nature conspires to destroy you constantly and is going to do that with pain and anxiety and aging. And then there's the uncontrollability and darkness of your own psyche. And everyone faces those. Now, we face the positive elements of those too, the beneficence of culture, the beauty of nature, the glory of the human spirit. That's there as well. You have reasons to be deceitful, resentful, and arrogant, but it's not a good game unless you want to produce hell. We have to strive not to be wretched. There's something that doesn't seem fair about that. Why couldn't we just be happy being who and what we are? Why is it that we're punished if we don't strive? Well, I don't know. We're negentropic organisms, right? I mean, we have to maintain this incredible complexity in the face of a dissipating universe. It requires effort. It's the second law of thermodynamics, I believe. That's why we have to strive. Well, why is the world constituted that way? I guess it's an infantile paradisal wish in some regard. Couldn't we just be rewarded for who we are? I can understand that. But I don't think that it works. I don't think that's how things function like that. And I don't think probably in the final analysis we really want them to. I don't know if anyone enjoys undeserved reward. You know, it feels kind of creepy, doesn't it, to be rewarded for something you didn't do?
It does. I'm obsessed with this idea of the physics of being human, that there are just certain things that are true, that our brain has algorithms running in them that are going to push us to be striving to, push against entropy. Partly just you have to risk danger to go out and get food and provide for your family and keep them safe. So it makes sense that you have that pushing at your back. Also seems to me that you have an innate drive for progress and that you'll never be happy if you're not advancing in some way, getting better at something.
Well, I think that's technically true, and in Maps of Meaning in particular, I make a neuropsychological argument for that mostly based on the work of Jeffrey Gray, who I think was the greatest neuropsychologist of the last half of the 20th century. And he drew a lot of his ideas from Norbert Wiener, who was a cybernetic theorist who was instrumental in the development of artificial intelligence. These ideas have a stellar academic origin. And positive emotion, Gray laid this out better than anyone else, the positive emotion that we find sustaining is experienced in relationship to an unachieved goal. It's hope that drives us forward. We want something, and if we see ourselves moving towards that, then we're in the grip of the positive emotion that we find sustaining. It isn't the attainment. Attainment is satiating. Attainment shuts down the system that has been striving for that particular object of attainment. If you're hungry and you eat, you stop being hungry. Now, that's good because the hunger is gone, but that whole frame disappears. You can no longer strive within that frame.
and you need a new frame to strive towards. And so technically, and this is well established as far as I'm concerned, we even know the drugs that people abuse, cocaine, let's say, amphetamines, the ones that are potent sources of positive emotion, activate the system that regulates our emotional response to evidence that we're moving towards a desired goal. So cocaine, for example, is an exhilarating drug. It makes you feel that things are worthwhile because it hijacks the system that does indicate that things are worthwhile. So this is deeply, this striving aspect is deeply rooted in our biology. One of the things I've noticed time and time again is that whenever I talk about the relationship between responsibility and meaning, the crowds that I'm talking to go silent. Say, look, you need a meaning to sustain you through the vicissitudes of life. Okay, well, try to debate that. It's like, is life painful? Yes. Is it anxiety provoking? Yes. Is it uncertain? Yes. Is it painful beyond bearing sometimes? Yes. It's difficult. Everyone agrees about that. Now, they might disagree about how difficult, but that doesn't matter. That the central point holds. Okay, what if you think that's all pointless? Well, that doesn't seem very helpful. Okay, so you need a sustaining meaning. Well, where do you find that? Well, you generally find it in responsibility to yourself and to other people. And people ask themselves those questions when I'm talking, because I ask them to ask themselves those questions, and that's the answer. Well, what's meaningful? Well, I have a meaningful relationship with my father. I have a meaningful relationship with my wife. I have a meaningful relationship with my pet, because I take care of that pet. When I commit to something and make sacrifices, that sacrifice is something I also talk about a lot in both of the last two books. If something's valuable, you'll make sacrifices to attain it. And that discovery of sacrifice, I think that's what separates it's one of the primary factors separating human beings from animals. Because we discovered that we could let go of something we value in the present, and we would gain something we value even more in the future. We acted that out dramatically in all sorts of strange ways over thousands and thousands of years before it was formalizable psychologically. But it's a massive discovery. I can forego gratification in a particular way and benefit in the future. So I can share the proceeds of my hunt. And I store up future food in the form of reputation and the favors I'm owed now by other people. It's a massive discovery. Worth asking yourself. It's like, drop what you're doing that's foolish, that you know is foolish, and pick an aim that's worthwhile, to make things better for yourself, like you're worth taking care of, like you're worth something, and to surround yourself with people who believe the same and who are rejoicing in your accomplishments and unhappy when you fail, right? And you're comparing yourself to your accomplishments of yesterday and not to someone else's today, so that you're not jealous and bitter. And you put your own house in order so that you're not cursing the world when some of its disarray might be your fault. And you're trying to pursue something meaningful, and you're doing your best to tell the truth and all of that. And then you see what happens. Who the hell are you? You think you're a miracle of some bloody bizarre sort. We've been around for 3.5 billion years. Every single one of your relatives propagated successfully. And here you are, against all possible odds, in this world of hell in some sense, and bitterness and tyranny and malevolence. And yet, God only knows what's inside you, this capacity for consciousness, the capacity to confront potential and to turn it into something good. That's us, man. That's the Western story. That's the individual as the cornerstone of the state.
That's our responsibility. And it really is who we are. And so we need to know that, and we need to remember it, and we need to act it out. And then maybe we can see what we can do about it, and see how good we could make things. And maybe that would be the purpose of your damn life, right? Not to be happy. It's like, there's problems to be solved. Be happy after you solve the goddamn things, right? So I learned, because I looked at dark things, that I learned that the light was more powerful than the darkness as far as that I was concerned, and that people were capable, each of us, of remarkable things, and that we need to know that that's what we are. We're this consciousness that confronts potential with all its catastrophe. That's what we are. That's what makes us in the image of God. That's what gives us our intrinsic value. And that idea that we have intrinsic value, that's the bedrock presupposition of our state. We're going to question that, or we're going to live it out. Better to live it out. Find out who you are.
In order to have any positive meaning in your life, you have to have identified a goal, and you have to be working towards it. And there is a technical reason for that. And the technical reason, as far as I can tell, is that the circuitry that produces the kind of positive emotion that people really like is only activated when you notice that when you're proceeding towards a goal that you value. And so that means that if you don't have a goal that you value, you can't have any positive emotion. So technically that's the incentive reward system, and the underlying circuitry is dopaminergic, and when that circuitry is activated, then it's part of the exploratory circuit. It gives you the sense of being actively engaged in something worthwhile. And that's, you tend to think of positive emotion as something produced by reward, but there's two kinds of positive emotion. One is the reward that's associated with satiation, and that's consummatory reward, and that's the reward you get when you're hungry and you eat. But the thing about eating when you're hungry is that it destroys the framework within which you were operating, right? It's time to eat. Well, you eat, and then that framework's no longer relevant. So the consummatory reward eliminates the value framework. And then you're stuck with, well, what are you going to do next? And so the consummatory reward has with it its own problems, but the incentive reward is constantly what keeps you moving forward. And incentive reward, because it's dopaminergic, also is analgesic, literally analgesic. So if you're in pain, you take opiates, and that will cut the pain, but so will psychomotor stimulants like cocaine or amphetamines. And so it's literally the case that if you're engaged in something that's engaging and you're working towards a goal, that you're going to feel less pain. And you can see this happening with athletes who, they'll break their thumb or something, or maybe sometimes even their ankle, and they'll keep playing the game. Of course, afterwards they're suffering like mad, but the fact that they're so filled with goal-directed enthusiasm means that, well, the pain systems are in some sense shut off. So that's an interesting thing, because what it suggests, then you could imagine, I might say, well, how happy are you that you've made a certain amount of progress? And if you think about it, what you'd say is, well, it depends on how much progress and in relationship to what. So hypothetically, you're going to be happier if you've made quite a bit of progress towards a really important goal. And then you have to think through what it means for a goal to be really important, because that's not obvious. Now, you could say, you're in this class and you're listening to some information, and maybe there's two reasons for that. You might find the information interesting per se, but let's forget about that for a minute. You need to listen to the information so that you can do well on the assignments, so that you can do well in the class. You need to do well in your classes so that you can finish up your degree. You need to finish up your degree so that you can find your place in the world. You need to do that so that you're financially stable, and maybe you can start a family and have a life, and that's all part of being a good person, something like that. And so that's a hierarchy of goals, and you might say that being a good person would be the thing, however vaguely thought through, that's at the top of that hierarchy. And then when you're doing things that serve that ultimate purpose, then you're going to find those more meaningful, and that meaning is actually produced as a consequence of the engagement of this exploratory circuit that's nested right down in your hypothalamus. It's really, really old. It's as old as thirst, and it's as old as hunger. It's really an old system. And so you want to have that thing activated.
Like, even if you take the most cynical of ideas, let's say that life is irredeemable suffering and perhaps isn't even justified because of that, it still seems to me that you have an ethical duty, let's say, to live in a manner that reduces that to the degree that that's possible.
And so, and I think that that can be experienced as meaningful in some sense independently of the transcendent context. Now, I don't exactly know how to strip off the transcendent context, because one of the things I would say that's happened to me is, because I've spent so much time looking at the horrible things that people have done, is that it's like Jung said that this is one of his famous quotes. He said, "No tree can reach up to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." And so, as I've dug deeper into the depravity of human beings, my sense of the possibility of human beings has also grown, what would you say, in proportion. And until I've become convinced, actually, that good is a more powerful force than evil, even though evil is an unbelievably powerful force. And so I can't really strip the transcendent away. Now, what bearing that has on eternity, say on an afterlife, I mean, I can't say anything about that. The only thing I guess I can say is that there are many things about being that we don't understand in the least. And we don't understand the nature of consciousness or the nature of time. So I wouldn't despair about that. But yes, I think that life can still be meaningful without there being a necessity of an afterlife. You might say that someone who is incapable of cruelty is a higher moral being than someone who is capable of cruelty. And I would say, and this follows Jung as well, that that's incorrect, and it's dangerously incorrect, because if you are not capable of cruelty, you are absolutely a victim to anyone who is. And so part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control. And you know, a lot of martial arts concentrate on exactly that as part of their philosophy of training. It's like, we're not training you to fight. We're training you to be peaceful and awake and avoid fights. But if you happen to have to get in one, and I guess the philosophy also is that if you're competent at fighting, that actually decreases the probability that you're going to have to fight, because when someone pushes you, you'll be able to respond with confidence, and with any luck, and this is certainly the case with bullies, with any luck, a reasonable show of confidence, which is very much equivalent to a show of dominance, is going to be enough to make the bully back off. And so the strength that you develop in your monstrousness is actually the best guarantee of peace. And that's partly why Jung believed that it was necessary for people to integrate their shadow. And he said that was a terrible thing for people to attempt, because the human shadow, which is all those things about yourself that you don't want to realize, reaches all the way to hell. And what he meant by that was, it's through an analysis of your own shadow that you can come to understand why other people are capable, and you as well, of the sorts of terrible atrocities that characterized, let's say, the 20th century. And without that understanding, there's no possibility of bringing it under control. When you study Nazi Germany, for example, or you study the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, and you're asking yourself, well, what are these perpetrators like? Forget about the victims, let's talk about the perpetrators. The answer is, they're just like you. And if you don't know that, that just means that you don't know anything about people, including yourself. And then it also means that you have to discover why they're just like you. And believe me, that's no picnic. So that's enough to traumatize people, and that's partly why they don't do it. And it's also partly why the path to enlightenment and wisdom is seldom trod upon, because if it was all a matter of following your bliss and doing what made you happy, then everyone in the world would be a paragon of wisdom. But it's not that at all. It's a matter of facing the thing you least want to face. And everyone has that there's this old story in King Arthur where the knights go off to look for the Holy Grail, which is either the cup that Christ drank out of at the Last Supper, or the cup into which the blood that gushed from his side was poured when he was crucified. The stories vary, but it's basically a holy object, like the phoenix in some sense, that's a representation of transformation. So it's an ideal, and so King Arthur's knights, who sit at a round table because they're all roughly equal, go off to find the most valuable thing, and where do you look for the most valuable thing when you don't know where it is? Well, each of the knights looks at the forest surrounding the castle and enters the forest at the point that looks darkest to him. And that's a good thing to understand, because the gateway to wisdom and the gateway to the development of personality, which is exactly the same thing, is precisely through the portal that you do not want to climb through. And the reason for that's actually quite technical. This is a Jungian presupposition too, is that, well, there's a bunch of things about you that are underdeveloped, and a lot of those things are because there's things you've avoided looking at because you don't want to look at them, and there's parts of you you've avoided developing because it's hard for you to develop those parts. And so it's by virtual necessity that what you need is where you don't want to look, because that's where you've kept it. Enthusiasm and joy, happiness, let's say, is 100% dependent, as far as we can tell, on observations that you're progressing towards a valued goal. It's not attainment focused, that's satiation. You get something you want and you're satisfied about it. That's a whole different neurochemical system. But enthusiasm and joy that people associate with happiness manifests itself when you're moving towards a valued goal. So if you don't prioritize your goals because you don't exist within a structure of value, then you have no positive emotion. And positive emotion is half of forward-moving motivation. Well, in fact, in terms of forward movement, it's almost all the motivation, because the embodied manifestation of positive emotion is the movement towards a valued goal. That's what it is. That's why you have the positive emotion, because you are a creature that can move towards goals. And the emotional signaling of that is positive emotion. No goal, no positive emotion. No hierarchy of goals, dilution or eradication of positive emotion. Because if you're confused enough and you have 100 goals and you can't prioritize them, then every goal has 1% of the significance necessary to really move you forward. And so to be maximally motivated, you need to know why you're doing what you're doing, all the way up Jacob's ladder. All the way up. And that brings us to the notion of the macrocosm that's the heavenly hierarchy. And in some sense, it's a psychological macrocosm, although not in all senses, because it brings society into the purview. So here's a proposition. Any system of priorities is a structure of values. So you may or may not accept the proposition that you have to hierarchically arrange your perceptions. You also, by the way, have to do the same thing on the action front. Because if you're inclined to do 10 things at once, you can do none. And consciousness, by the way, is a very narrow channel. And we generally can only concentrate on one thing at a time. And the reason for that, in some sense, is because we can only act out one thing at a time. And so not only do you have to prioritize your perceptions, which are action-based anyways, you also have to prioritize what you're going to do. Because you have to do the first thing first. And then the second thing, and the third thing, and that's obviously a structure of priority. And a structure of priority is a structure of comparative value, and a hierarchical structure of comparative value is an ethic. And so what that means, as far as I can tell, and this is something, if it's true, is that we cannot see the world except through an ethic. And I mean that literally as well as metaphorically. You literally cannot see the world or act in it. You cannot perceive the world except through a structure, a hierarchical structure of value, which is an ethic. And so then I would say, and here's something else to chew on for like 20 years, a story is a verbal description of a hierarchy of perceptual and action prioritization. And the reason that we're so attracted to stories is because it's so difficult to perceive and act in the world that we're hungry at the level of soul for a narrative that represents to us
a hierarchical ethos that we could embody as a model for emulation. And so that's what our stories are. They're models, they're ritual models for emulation, most fundamentally. And the anti-hero story, well, that's easy enough to contend with. It's like, watch this person who ends up in catastrophe and hell and do the opposite of whatever it is they're doing. And so that's a powerful lesson, because there's something very compelling, as we said before, about very powerful negative emotion. And so, even if you don't believe in heaven, you might be able to conjure up a belief in hell. And if you can't, I would say, well, you're either not using your imagination, or you're hiding, or so far, you're just lucky. But I wouldn't expect that to last. One question might be, well, what do you mean to be a good person? And of course, that's the problem of the logos. And the answer to that would be something like, well, I want to be the proper mediator between possibility and actuality, such that the best possible actuality can be manifested by the possibility that I confront. And every bloody thing you do, everything you see, is either nested in a unified hierarchy like that, or it's not. So let's say, what happens if it's not? Well, we actually know what happens if it's not. And let's say you're not unified psychologically in your value orientation. Okay, what's the consequence? Well, entropy. That's the first consequence. It's like, are you doing one thing, which you know what you're doing and can commit yourself to and can actually undertake, or are you so confused that you need to do 15 things at the same time, and you don't know which of them is most important? And the importance, by the way, is diluted by the multiplicity, right? Because if you pick something out as singularly important, you actually elevate it as important. If 15 things all of a sudden become equally important, they're all 1/15th as important, because if they weren't, you wouldn't have a problem sequencing them, and that means they're not motivating. So one of the consequences of that is that there's no positive emotion. And so you can certainly see the catastrophe, and even the hellish catastrophe, beckoning. And you might think, plotting a route that would make that the least likely seems to be a good idea. And so part of the reason that we're fascinated by villains and supervillains, for that example, or part of the reason we're fascinated and endlessly so with figures like Lucifer and Satan, is because we're attempting to flesh out the nature of the antithesis to the worst kind of hierarchy of values. And that's gripping to us. It's gripping to us. Now, there's more to it as well, because we also will turn our attention to the negative to fortify ourselves against the negative in preparation for confrontation with the negative. And so we can do that through use of fiction. And that's what we're doing, for example, at least in part, when we do such strange things as amuse ourselves with horror films. And so, any system of priorities is a structure of values. That's an ethic. It's hierarchical, because one thing has to be put before many things, and things have to be done in sequence, and everything has to proceed in some sense in an intelligible manner towards the highest possible goal. And the alternative to that is not only the radical unhappiness that I already described, which is the destruction of any possibility of enthusiastic engagement with life in a meaningful sense on the positive front, but the other price you pay for being confused about your ethic is anxiety. Most particularly anxiety. Because anxiety is actually a signal of entropy in perception and action. If you don't know what you're doing, you don't know where you are. And you don't know where you're going. And if you're in a place where you don't know where you are or where you're going, you're in danger. Because that's unmapped territory. And God only knows what lurks in unmapped territory. And you can think about that biologically. If you're somewhere you don't understand and you don't know where you're going, well, there's always the possibility of predation. But you can think about it metaphysically too, and that's worthwhile. If you're so confused and disoriented that you don't know where you are or where you're going, there are predators of the spirit who are much worse than snakes that are waiting in wait for you. And the probability that you'll move from aimless, hopeless, joyless anxiety to nihilism, corrosive bitterness, and genocidal fantasy in the fundamental extreme is very high. And so that's possession by a predator of the spirit in the desert of the soul. And that's real. So a system of priorities is a structure of values, an ethic. A narrative, and that would include a drama, is the description of a structure of values or an ethic or a set of priorities. We see and act out the world through what, when described, is a narrative. Now that's interesting. That's an interest, if that's true, it's very interesting. It's interesting partly because, you know, the postmodernists, who I don't admire, generally speaking, they figured this out. They figured out that we likely see the world through a story. And that might even be true for scientists, is that a scientist, and Carl Jung believed this too, by the way, is that science takes place within a surrounding narrative. Now, what the postmodernists did, the French postmodernists in particular, and then the Americans through Yale most particularly, they leapt from problem, which was how do we perceive, solution, we see the world through a narrative, to narrow solution, which is that we prioritize our perceptions and our actions by imposing a narrative of power and dominance. And they swiped that from the Marxists. And that is simply not true. There is no evidence for that. Animals don't even do that in their social communities, or when they do it, they erect unstable and extremely violent social hierarchies. There's no evidence whatsoever that hierarchies predicated on a narrative of power function productively, even for the people that impose the narrative of power. How can failing to align yourself with reality work? How is that possibly going to work? Well, you say, well, I can, you know, if I lie, I get away with something. It's like, no, you don't. I tell you, I swear this is true. In all of my clinical practice, I have never, ever seen anyone ever get away with anything even once. You think the chickens won't come home to roost. It's like, all that means is you're too stupid to see what your lies caused, or too blind or too self-deceptive. You just don't see it. And so you don't get away with anything. Nothing. It's terrifying to actually understand that. It's terrifying. What if you can't get away with anything, ever? You know? Well, that's the judgmental God, fundamentally. And then, of course you can't get away with anything, because imagine that you took a flexible plastic comb, you know, and you bent it backwards, and you say, well, I got away with that. It's like, well, what's going to happen when you let go? It's going to snap back and hit you in the face. And that's life, man. You warp the structure of reality. You think you are someone who can warp the structure of reality with your words and get away with it? Really? No, man, that should terrify you right to the core of your soul. You're not God. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Because you can't tell the truth, right? Because who are you to tell the truth? That's a mighty tall order, man. But you can stop saying things that you know are lies. And that will change your life if you do that.
Why would it change their life?
Well, how can you adapt to reality when you falsify it? And you think, well, I'm just lying to other people. No, you're not. You can't just lie to other people, because what you say becomes you, especially if you practice it, because we build ourselves out of words. And that can be lies in action too. It's like, don't say things you know to be false. That's a good start, man. And it allies yourself with the truth. And that, like, how can that be a bad idea? How could you possibly defend the idea that you could warp the structure of reality and get away with it? I mean, who, like I said, who do you think you are? Reality is, you don't mess with it. Like, it kills you, and it'll torture you quite a lot before doing that if you're particularly unlucky. So beware. You know, they say the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. That's that judgmental God. It's like, you violate your conscience, man, you will pay. That's hell. Do you want the horror of failure or the certainty of failure? The horror of potential failure or the certainty of failure? Because if you don't do this, you will fail.
Now, it'll be put off, but it will absolutely happen. And so that fear, I understand why that stops people. It's no joke to be rejected. And it's going to happen while you practice. And it's a real fear. But you're deluding yourself by thinking that there's a no fear option. There's just a delayed fear option. Right? Because if you don't get this right, well, you're going to fail for sure. And then you're going to be miserable and vindictive and bitter and anxiety-ridden. And you're going to cause trouble for yourself. And you're going to take it out on women and other men. And like, that's an ugly path, man. And so I see why you're afraid, but you should be way more afraid of that. And that's a nice way to help people get their thinking straight about fear. It's like, no zero fear path. There is nothing that will make you more powerful than your words. And so if you think that reading and writing is for pansies and dimwits, you know, or teachers' pets, you're seriously misinformed. And so, you know, I talk to people like Jocko Willink, and Jocko's as tough a guy as you could ever hope to encounter about literacy, and a number of other people too who are also seriously tough guys. They all know perfectly well that literacy is a huge part of what's made them unstoppable. And you don't take that lightly. You know, it's really serious. And it's a failing of our education system that it's not, that literacy isn't marketed properly to young men. It's like, straighten up, speak properly, write, learn to write. Why? Because that's the same as learning to think. And why should you think? Well, because you won't do as many stupid things and your horizons will widen. And then too, when you need to entice people along your journey, hopefully somewhere good, you'll be able to do it because you'll be compelling. Let's say the marketing association between toughness and dangerousness and literacy. There's something wrong about that, we think, some weird way. And that's wrong. It's like, sure, you should be physically tough and you should be tough in your temperament, as well as having the capacity for play and compassion. You know, that has to be developed too. But that's not enough. And I don't care how tough you are physically, you're nowhere near as tough as you would be if you were physically tough and really literate. And then you're an unstoppable force, and hopefully for good. And that's a much tougher battle than, you know, being tough for your own idiotic, selfish ends. That's just pathetic. And so, get your words together and then see what you can do. And don't be thinking that that's somehow beneath you. That just means you're stupid that you think that. You don't know anything. You think that. It's wrong. And you're limiting yourself so much you can't even imagine it. You might not even figure it out till you're 60 and then it's too late. So read, write, think. Why should you read? Well, do you want to be stupid? Do you want to be stupid? What happens when you're stupid? You walk into walls because you don't see them. And if someone comes along who's more educated than you, more literate and cannier, you'll lose, man. You'll lose. And you'll lose too because you can't think properly. So you won't aim at the right things and you won't be informed by the great individuals of the past. And you need that. We're historical creatures. This isn't optional. It helps you become who you could be. It helps you move out into the world and have your great adventure. And to bring people along. God only knows what you can do if you've got your words lined up properly. And young men would listen to that if someone who knew what they were talking about was telling them that. There's no safe path. There's a noble path. There's an honorable path. There's no safe path. And possibly you wouldn't want that anyways because, well, who are you exactly, you know? Look at you, you know, warrior stock. Every single one of your ancestors has stayed alive for 3.5 billion years. It's like, good work, man. That's a lot. And so, what makes you so sure you're built for safety? What makes you so sure that that's what we should strive for? And then if you want adventure, I'll tell you what an adventure is. You tell the truth as nearly as you can, and you'll have the adventure of your life. That's for sure. And that isn't trying to fit in because you're naive or, you know, because you're too afraid to lie. That doesn't make you telling the truth if you're too afraid to lie. That's, you know, in a cowardly sort of way. There's a wise way of being too afraid to lie. It's lies that turn competence into tyranny. So don't lie unless you want to be an incompetent tyrant. And you think that's easier. It's like, in some ways, I suppose, it's easier because you can slide into that, but existentially, it's hell. And hell has this weird quality because it feels like it's eternal. Money has its utility, primarily as a tool for doing things, really. You know, you can think about it as a means for obtaining luxury items, but that gets dull pretty quickly for most people that have any sense. It's like, I've been to the houses of very wealthy people, and some of them are quite remarkable, but most of because they're creative people. But most of the time, I remember going to a gated community, for example, in California, and it was a huge house. It was probably 10,000 square feet. But it was no different than a 2,000 square foot house. It was just bigger. Like the stoves were bigger, the fridge was bigger, the wine cellar was bigger, the rooms were bigger. Who cares? It's more to take care of. It's not helpful for anything unless you're using it for a creative purpose. And you know, they also lived in a gated community, and you can hardly imagine anything duller than that. You know, like, there's nothing there. There's no bars, there's no nightlife, there's no nightclubs, there's no corner stores, there's no churches, there's nowhere for people to hang out. There's not even any sidewalks. So who cares? Males who occupy positions of power are much more attractive to women. So there's a famous Canadian psychologist, team of Canadian psychologists, Margot Wilson and Martin Daly, who worked out at Hamilton, at McMaster, Canada's most outstanding evolutionary psychologists, did a study at one point showing that, first of all, they established the relationship between inequality and male aggression. The correlation is like 0.8. It's off the charts, man. It's like, it's one of, maybe it might be the most powerful relationship between two hypothetically independent variables that psychologists or social scientists have ever discovered. It's off the charts. So inequality fosters male-on-male violence, and it's because of competition for scarce resources, and it's driven by sexual selection pressures, roughly speaking.
Yes.
One of the things that Daly and Wilson did, and I believe this was in Chicago as well, they did an ethnological, anthropological study of the consequence of interracial murder in a gang setting in Chicago. So basically what would happen is two gangs were vying for territorial dominance, let's say, and there was some kind of violent exchange. So let's call it a fight. Well, the thing is, if you're in one gang and I'm in another, and we engage in a violent altercation, one of us perhaps might die, but who's going to die is a toss-up, right? So that means that I can plead self-defense if I'm involved in that altercation. Well, and so generally what happened was that the plea was self-defense. The charge was plea bargained down to involuntary manslaughter or to manslaughter. The person was thrown in jail or sentenced for perhaps 3 years and served something like 18 months. And then when they re-entered the fray, when they were back out on the streets, their credibility had increased substantially, and so had their probability of success. So the left's concern with inequality is a justifiable concern. The problem is we don't know what to do with it. We don't know what to do about it. It's very difficult to shovel money and other resources, because it isn't only money that this sort of process applies to. It's very difficult to shovel resources from the pile at the top down to the many at the bottom who are hovering around zero.
Yeah.
So it's something that has to be taken into account because, well, first, it's not good for everybody to be stacking up at zero, and second, it destabilizes the society itself. So, but that doesn't mean we know what to do about it. That's the critical thing. It also doesn't mean that the reason that the people at the top have most of the resources, regardless of what those resources are, it doesn't mean that the reason they have them is because they're exploiting the people at the bottom. Now, there is an element of exploitation in any complex productive system, always, because they don't operate completely fairly, right? So yeah, suffering is built into the fabric of human existence. And so you are vulnerable and you will die. And you can, that's harsh, that's tragic, I would say. And tragedy is built into being. And so to the degree that you partake in that tragedy, you could consider yourself, although I think it's the wrong way of conceptualizing it, you could consider yourself as a victim among the universality of victimhood. I think that's not a helpful way of looking at it because it leads to despair. But to think of yourself as a particular victim or to think of yourself as a victim among the privileged, I think that gets dangerous extraordinarily rapidly. The chaos is hiding in what's irrelevant. And that's a very interesting observation, because since the chaos is virtually infinite, it's a real question. Where the hell do you put it? Well, you put it in what you ignore. And you can ignore it as long as it isn't actively interfering with your movement forward. You can assume that it doesn't matter, that it isn't matter, that it doesn't matter. Same thing. All right, so here's the kicker. There's one more class of things that you can run into along the way. And this is where the chaos breaks through. So let's say you're moving from point A to point B, and something that you don't expect occurs, and it gets in the way. So let's say that you're living with someone, and maybe you kind of like them. You're not married, so you don't like them that much, because otherwise you'd ask them to marry you. But anyways, and so a quarter of you is looking for something better, and 3/4 of you is half satisfied, something like that. And then the person, because we're ambivalent about such things, and then the person you discover, or the person announces that they've been having an affair. Okay, so then how are you supposed to respond emotionally to that? Well, the part of you that wasn't all that committed to the relationship is kind of exhilarated by that, and then the 3/4 of you that's half satisfied is hurt, and you're going to exploit that part for sure in the ensuing discussions, and not mention the, oh, that's kind of exciting that you've, betrayed me that way. But the point is that that's a hole. Now what's happened is a hole you have this structure that you're walking on, like ice, like the thin ice that you're skating on, and now there's a hole in it. And the hole, we don't even know how deep the hole is, but you know there's a hole there, and so now you're anxious about it, though maybe also a little bit excited, because God only knows what's down there. But you don't know what to do with that hole, because it could spread very badly on you. It could be that, the whole relationship was a facade, and that all your relationships have been facades, and that the reason that is because you're so damn shallow that it's impossible for you to have a relationship that isn't just a facade, and that's partly because you don't pay any attention to other people, and it's also partly because you're malevolent and selfish. So that's a nasty thing to discover. Or maybe that's the sort of person that you're attracting, which would make sense, actually, if that's the sort of person that you are. And so there are certain things that you can encounter that basically unglue you. And what happens is that those moments of being unglued travel up that entire hierarchy of presuppositions. It's like, because one of the logical conclusions to being betrayed in a relationship is that you're truly a bad person. Now, another equally logical conclusion is that the person that you're with is really a bad person, and another logical conclusion is all people are truly bad people. In macro ways and in micro ways, you can't trust anyone. You can't trust women, you can't trust men, you can't trust human beings, you can't trust yourself. The whole place is a catastrophe. It's a nightmare. Well, then you can fall through into chaos. Now, the way your body responds to that, or maybe, you're supposed to be getting a promotion at work. That's good. You're all chipper about the promotion at work, and you walk into your boss's office because he or she wants to see you, and they say, well, we've reviewed your performance over the last few years, and your performance has been somewhere between mediocre and decent, and we're downsizing, and see you later. That's not a raise or a promotion, that's for sure. That's a hole that you fall into. And the question is, well, what do you make of that, right? How do you frame that? How do you take that emergent chaos and make habitable order out of it? You don't know. Is the whole capitalist system rotten to the core? I mean, that's a convenient explanation under those circumstances, that's for sure. Were you working for a psychopathic son of a bitch? Did you make the wrong choice in university, and was that your father's fault because you never did what you want, or was it your fault for not standing up to him? Or is it a dying industry, or is maybe this a wake-up call that you should go do something else that you've been waiting to do, you know, that you've actually wanted to do your whole life, and that's why you're doing such a miserable job at your current occupation because you're bitter and resentful about the fact that you never did what you want? You don't know. It's all of those things at once. And that's very stressful because all of those things at once is too many things. And that's the reemergence of chaos. That's the flood. That's the return to the beginning of the cosmos. That's another way that it's been represented mythologically. It's that you voyage all the way back to the beginning of the cosmos when there's nothing but undifferentiated chaos. And that's what you're confronting. And maybe it's too much for you. And often it is. I mean, that can be traumatizing. It can hurt your brain. You know, it's just too much for you to bear. But it doesn't matter. You're stuck with it. And so how do you respond to that? Well, some of it is catastrophic negative emotion. You freeze, and that's protective. And maybe you don't even want to move. You don't want to bloody well get out of bed for a week, and that's because your body is reacting as if the bedroom floor is covered with snakes, and the best thing for you to do is just not move, just freeze. Not a pleasant situation to be in, because you're hyper aroused, very, very physiologically demanding, and there's zero about it that's productive, except maybe the snakes won't see you. But they've already seen you, so that isn't helping very well. So you've got all this undifferentiated negative emotion, anxiety, fear, hurt, anger, guilt, shame, emotional pain, the whole plethora of catastrophes. And then maybe on the other side, lurking down there is, thank God I'm done with that job. I just bloody well hate it. I drag myself off to work every day. And there's a little part of my soul that's so goddamn happy I finally got fired that I can hardly stand it. You know, and maybe you don't even admit that to yourself because, well, that would mean that all that time you spent at the job was just sunk cost. You're deluding yourself the whole time. It is an interesting thing to consider, though, sometimes if you're in the unpleasant circumstance of having to fire someone. You know, sometimes firing someone is the best thing that can happen to them, which doesn't mean that you should go out and, like, enjoy it. Although I have met very disagreeable people who actually enjoyed firing people. I'll tell you a story about that at some point because it's quite interesting. But, you know, sometimes if someone's just limping along in their job and doing it as miserably and wretchedly as they possibly can imagine, the best thing you can do to them, for them, is to say, you know, you're failing at this. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you would have to be failing at absolutely everything else in the entire world. So maybe you should just accept the damn failure and go off and try something new. And I mean, that's terrifying for people, and I know they hate it and all that, but sometimes it's better than the alternative, which is just slow, torturous death. The idea was there was something to dreams. And I suppose what Freud did is said, hey, look, isn't it strange? We have this whole other form of thought that we engage in at night, and it speaks in a language that we don't really understand. And so what the hell is that? And you can say, and many modern people do, dreams are of no significance, or even that they're random processes, which is an absurd proposition, obviously, because whatever they are, they're obviously not random. So Freud's idea was that there was something in dreams that was informative. So that's now he had a method for extracting out from the dream what the dream purported to represent, and he outlined that in great detail in the Interpretation of Dreams. And if you want to read one book by Freud, I would highly recommend that one. It's a very long book and it's very detailed, but Freud does an extraordinarily comprehensive analysis of the way that dreams work. Now he made because he had brought a theoretical framework to bear even on his investigation into dream structure, he concluded Jung had a dream once, if I remember correctly, that Freud and Jung were excavating a basement. And so Freud had outlined, Freud had already discovered the basement, let's say, so that would be the unconscious structure of the psyche. And Jung broke through into another basement that was a multi-chambered place, so many, many, many rooms. And I suppose what drove Jung and Freud apart was Jung's proposition that there was a hell of a lot more going on down there than had already met the eye. And they broke on the idea that the sexual impulse was primary, roughly speaking. They broke when Jung wrote a book called Symbols of Transformation, which is actually, there's 3 books that I know of that are sort of like maps of meaning. One is Symbols of Transformation. One is a book by Erich Neumann called The Origins and History of Consciousness. And the third one, well, is Maps of Meaning. They're the same book. They're just like they're trying to solve the same problem from 3 different directions. They're all attempts to address the same problem. And so Symbols of Transformation was a book that Jung wrote about the fantasies of a schizophrenic American woman. And he was trying to relate her fantasies to these old mythological ideas. And Jung's idea, essentially, and this is an idea that was shared by people like Piaget, so we're not going to say that Jung or Freud just pulled this idea out of the air, was that the birthplace of mythology and literature, for that matter, was the dream. That they share structural, that they share what? Mode of information presentation. And it's a relatively radical hypothesis, but given that they both represent dreams and mythological representations share an essentially narrative structure, and they're literary-like, I mean, it's not so unreasonable to notice that a dream at night is like the movie that you play in your head. And it's not unreasonable to note as well that the dreams that you have at night bear a relationship to the daydreams that you have during the day. It's a form of cognition. It seems like an involuntary form of cognition, though, and that's a very strange thing. So Jung thought about the dream as nature speaking of its own accord, roughly speaking. And so his idea was, well, when you sleep, you dream, but the dream happens to you. It's not something that you create the way that, and you don't even think about creating it. Because I might say, well, what are you thinking about? And you'll say, I'm thinking about whatever it is, and you'll take credit in some sense for thinking that because it seems like a voluntary activity. But what happens at night is that you think, but you think involuntarily. And so what Jung would say is that means that something is thinking in you. And that's a perfectly reasonable way of looking at it. And this is one of the things that's uncanny about the psychoanalysts, is they were willing to take their observations to their logical conclusion. There are things that think in you. What are those things? And what are they thinking? And why are they thinking it? Now, if you do dream analysis, and this is a tricky thing, because who's to say if your damn analysis is correct, right? It's very difficult to understand that. If you do dream analysis with someone, you generally have them lay out their dream. And then you ask them when they're going through their dream a second time, they lay out their dream and you can kind of get a picture of it. And then they lay out their dream a second time, and as they go through it, every time they mention a detail or a character, you ask them what that reminds them of. And the hypothesis is that the dream is presenting an image or an idea that's associated with a network of ideas, and that if you can expand on the network of ideas as you go through the dream, you can elaborate on the dream, you can expand it upwards, and you can start to see what it might be attempting to put forward. Now, Freud's idea was that the dream knew what it was doing, but that its content was being suppressed and oppressed by an internal censor. So the dream had to be sneaky about what it was saying because it was going to deliver a message that the person didn't want to hear. And that was tied up with his idea of repression. But that's not Jung's idea. See, Jung's idea was different. He said, no, the dream is trying to tell you what it's trying to tell you as clear as it can. That's just the best it can do. And so you could think of the dream, and this is, I believe, the right way to think about it. The dream is the birthplace of thought, the same way that artists are the birthplace of culture. It's exactly the same process. It's that your mind is groping outward to try to comprehend what it has not yet comprehended. And it does that first by trying to map it onto image. and it's doing that in the dream, and it's somewhat incoherent, and well, let's stick with incoherent, because it's not yet a full-fledged thought. It's the birthplace of thought. It's a fantasy about what might be. And then if you can grip the fantasy and share it with other people, then maybe they can elaborate upon it and bring it into being with more clarity than it would be if it merely existed as the precursor of a thought in your imagination.
Your life is meaningless while you're not pursuing a valued goal. I mean, you might be depressed too, and sometimes that can be like an illness, something that is really wrong with you. But a good rule of thumb is that if you find no joy in life, there's a very low probability that you're pursuing a goal that you regard intrinsically, like in the depths of your temperament, as worthwhile. And that's technically true because we do in fact experience most of the positive emotion, let's say, that's associated with emotions like joy. We experience that in relationship to a goal. So, well, then you want to find a goal that regulates your negative emotion and that brings you a certain amount of positive emotion and that expands your competence as you pursue it. And you will experience that as meaningful. That's really what meaning signals. Meaning signals you're doing all those things. You say, well, that's not real. It's like, don't listen to the semantic chatterbox so much. Right? There's levels of you that are far wiser than that. And you can watch what happens to you instead of noticing what you think. And that's another thing I always did with my clients, especially if they're depressed. It's like, well, let's watch you for a week and let's see when you're not so depressed. What are you doing when you're not so depressed? Now, for some people who had an endogenous depression, they were just depressed all the time. And sometimes an antidepressant was a good solution to that. But for people who were situationally depressed, which is equally common, let's say, there'd be quite a bit of variation in their mood. And say, well, it turns out that I'm not so depressed when I'm with so-and-so. It's like, okay, well, why? And more importantly, how can we do more of that? And when were you more depressed? Well, when I'm alone in my room, brooding. Okay, well, how about you spend 10% less time this week alone in your room? Like, we'll introduce 10%, let's say. So you're awake for 16 hours, so that's an hour. Now we'd probably go for 5%, half an hour. That's a hell of an improvement over 20 weeks, right? Because that would be 100% less time doing counterproductive brooding. I'm really on the side of the person that wants to do something positive with their life, to make their own life better, because I think that's where you should start. You should start by maximizing the quality of your own life. That's not a selfish thing, or if it is, it's the right kind of selfishness. And that you should figure out how to do that in a way that's of benefit to your friends and your family and your community. And you should take that deadly seriously. And the reason you should do that is because that just makes life better for everyone. And it reduces a fair bit of the misery that would otherwise be part and parcel of life, and it makes everything function smoothly. And one of the things I'm really curious about is what the world would be like if everybody decided to do that, because human beings are really remarkable creatures, and we hobble ourselves very badly with deception and resentment and revenge and the desire to make things worse and arrogance and all those sins, let's say, that make us deviate from our true path. And our true path should be something like, imagine the noblest aim that you can conceptualize and then sacrifice your life to attempting to attain it. And there's nothing in that isn't good for everyone. And so, apart from the fact that it requires a lot of responsibility, I just can't see why everyone wouldn't do that. And when I'm talking to young people and, shaking my finger and saying, grow the hell up and get mature and take on some responsibility, I'm not saying that because I'm an enemy of the person. I'm saying it because I'm the best friend of the part of them that would really like to walk in the light. And it's an invitation to walk in the light. And it would be remarkable. This is what we need to do, as far as I'm concerned, not only in the West, but in the world at large, but maybe in the West first, is we have to consciously decide that we're going to do everything we can as individuals to walk in the light, and to regard that as a noble and heroic endeavor, and to make that first and foremost in our lives.
And that's what we should be educating young people to do. And they can do that. And so I have dozens of people writing to me and talking to me all the time who are saying the same thing. They're saying, look, I've really been trying to get my act together over the last 6 months. I've been trying not to lie, which is slightly different than trying to tell the truth, right? It's a more humble goal to not lie, because you can tell when you're lying, but you can't necessarily tell when you're telling the truth. And I've been coming up with a plan, and I've been trying to discipline myself, and I've been cleaning up my room, which is like a nice humble act that involves transforming chaos into order. And they write and say, God, things are just working out way better for me. It's like, whoa, do it, man. That's just, you keep that up for 15 years and you'll be unbeatable. And that's what we should be convincing young people to be, is to be unbeatable. If you're not doing what you want to do or what you think you should be doing, drop the presumption that you know who you are and start to negotiate with yourself like you're a stranger who needs to be enticed forward. Because you don't know who you are, especially if you're not able to regulate your behavior, because that's evidence that you don't know who you are. Something is driving the ship. It's not you, or it's not the you think you are. And that's often extremely humiliating to people, because you may have to pick a goal that's so low, so lowly, right, that you embarrass yourself half to death by recognizing the necessity of you having to practice that. But the upside of that is that improvement, incremental improvement, scales exponentially. So even if you have to start somewhere really trivially, man, once you start, you can really scale up quickly. And so, and with an exponential increase, which I think improvement is, the trajectory of improvement is characterized by a power law function. It doesn't really matter where you start if you're doubling. Look, think, you get 1% better a week. That's not that high a goal, right? Maybe you could get rid of 1% of your stupidity and malevolence a week, or maybe every 2 weeks. Because that compounds, in 3 years, you are a completely different person. And it doesn't end there. So even if you're starting with, the horrible mixed bag of catastrophes that you actually are, if you're diligent in your attempts to rectify your errors and to aim higher, man. And then with regards to your goals, let's say you don't know what to do. Well, maybe you're high in openness, and so you're pulled in all sorts of directions, or maybe you're low in conscientiousness, or you're confused because you're anxious, or you haven't had any direction, you haven't had good mentoring, etc., etc. There's lots of reasons. Well, I would say, pick something, right? Pick something, a nameable goal, and then try to implement it. And what'll happen is, you'll learn a lot by trying to implement it. And one of the things you might learn is what a slightly better goal might be. Because if you try something diligently and you succeed or you fail, you're going to learn from the effort expended in the detailed implementation of the goal is going to inform you. It'll also transform you physiologically. It does that at a very basic level, neurophysiological level. You will be slightly different as a consequence of the attempt. And what that'll mean is that the next goal you pick will be a little more suited to you. And so it's this kind of pathway, right? It's like maybe the goal you should be attaining is here, but you don't know that because you're clueless. And so you aim there. Well, it's better than there. And it's not nothing. It's not cessation of movement. And, if you're supposed to go there and you go here, but you walk diligently towards it, you're a little closer once you get to here than you were here. And it's this oscillating self-corrective process that leads you to the final star. And you have to be willing to engage in erroneous experimentation to manage that. But it is a self-correcting process. And so one of the things I always talk to my clients about is, well, let's try something, and we'll reserve to ourselves the right to alter our trajectory. And then I would use as a corrective there, because you might say, well, how do you know when you're not just giving up, right? Instead of thinking maybe you need a different goal. And I would say, well, you can, if you're really concerned about your proclivity for self-deception, you can enter into a contract with yourself that you won't replace any goal you've set with a goal that's easier. And so you can switch your goal, but it has to be a little harder so that you check yourself against that tendency to withdraw and avoid and be self-deceptive. And that works like a charm. And if you do that with some degree of diligence, your goals will get better and more attainable, and you'll get happier too, because You don't experience happiness except in relationship to a goal. If you're feeling oppressed at work, or you're oppressed in your life, or you're oppressing yourself, then you got to notice that you're feeling oppressed. Then you have to notice that you're feeling resentful and angry and bitter, and maybe even like Cain in the story of Cain and Abel, because Cain is sort of the archetypal bitter man. And then you have to decide what it is that you need to do in order to remove from yourself that bitterness. And that usually means that there's something that you have to say. And then you have to say it because your soul depends on it. And not only does your soul depend on it, I would say the fate of the world depends on it. Because, you might be wrong, and then you should be straightened out. Maybe you're just being whiny and you have to talk to somebody about that. But it may be that you're actually detecting something wrong, some tyranny that's directed towards you and other people, and it's like your moral obligation to speak up about it. And so many workplaces become toxic, to use a terrible cliche, because the people in them won't speak up for what they actually want, or they speak up too late, and then they're all twisted up about it, and they're torturing other people because they're so unhappy, and so forth and so on. The humility element it took me a long time to understand why there's religious injunctions supporting humility, to even understand what the word really meant in that sort of technical sense. And it means something like this. It means what you don't know is more important than what you know. Then what you don't know can start to be your friend, you see. People are very defensive about what they know. But the thing is, you don't know enough. And you can tell you don't know enough because your life is not what it could be, and neither is the life of the people around you. You just don't know enough. And so what that means is that every time you encounter some evidence that you're ignorant, someone points it out, you should be happy about that, because you think, oh, you just told me how I'm wrong. It's like, great. Like maybe I had to sift through a lot of nonsense to get through the real message that you're telling me. But if you could actually tell me some way that I'm wrong, and then maybe give me a hint about how to not be wrong like that, well, then I wouldn't have to be wrong like that anymore. That would be a good thing. And you can embark on that adventure by listening to people. And if you listen to people, they'll tell you amazing things if you listen to them. And many of those things are little tools that you can put in your toolkit, like Batman. And then you can go out into the world and use those tools, and you don't have to fall blindly into a pit quite as often. And so the humility element is, well, do you want to be right, or do you want to be learning? And it's deeper than that. It's, do you want to be the tyrannical king who's already got everything figured out? Or do you want to be the continually transforming hero, or fool for that matter, who's getting better all the time? And that's actually a choice, It's a deep choice. And it's better to be the self-transforming fool who's humble enough to make friends with what he or she doesn't know, and to listen when people talk. And listening is a transformative exercise. Like if you listen to the people in your life, for example, if you actually listen to them, they'll tell you what's wrong with them and how to fix it and what they want. They can't even help it if you start listening, because people are so shocked if you actually listen to them that they tell you all sorts of things that they might not have even intended to, things they don't even know. And then you can work with that. And the other thing that's so interesting, now and then you have a meaningful conversation, right? You have a good conversation with someone, you walk away and you think, geez, we really connected, and I know more than I did when I came away from that conversation. And during the conversation, you're really engrossed in it. And that feeling of being engrossed is a feeling of meaning. And the feeling of meaning is engendered because you're having a transformative conversation. So your brain produces that feeling of meaning for you. It says, oh yeah, this is exactly where you should be, right here and now. It's the right place and time for you. And that's a great place to occupy. And so a good conversation where people are listening has exactly that nature. And the reason it has that nature is because it is in fact transformative. It's one of the truisms of clinical psychology. Like if you're a clinical psychologist, a huge part of what you do is just listen to people. It's like, they come in, they're unhappy, and they'd rather not be, something like that. You say, well, why do you think you might be unhappy? And they don't know. They have some ideas, and they may have to ramble around for like a year before they figure out why they're unhappy. They get rid of a bunch of reasons why they thought they were unhappy that are untrue, and then you kind of get to the heart of the problem. And then you might ask them, well, if you could have what you wanted so that your life would be okay, what would that look like? And then they have to ramble around a bunch about that because they don't really know. But the listening will straighten them out, because people think by talking. And in order to think, You have to have someone to listen, because it's very hard to think. Hardly anyone can think. And even the people who can think can only think about a limited number of things. But almost everybody can talk. And you can listen to yourself talk, and if someone listens to you, then you also have a foil for your thoughts, right? Because you can watch the person when you're talking and see if you're boring or see if you're amusing or if you're engrossing, all of those things. So like if you're arguing with your wife, let's say, or your husband, big party is going to want to win. And that's stupid because you don't want that. You want to defeat your wife in an argument. Oh, well, great. Like if she was going to disappear tomorrow, no problem. But like you're going to like live with defeated, miserable her for the next week? That's no good. So you listen and you think, okay, well, here's what I think you said, and maybe even make it a little stronger and more elaborated than was the case with the original utterance, so that you get the damn argument right. Because you don't want to win, you want to fix the problem. That's the winning. How do I decide if my inner voice is healthy or not, and how do I maintain it healthily? How can one tell if one's inner voice, judgment, or conscience is a healthy one and not a voice that is the result of an unhealthy mind due to past experiences? Now, that's a really interesting question. It's the question of conscience. I continually frequently, let's say, or yearly, ask my personality class attendees if they heard the voice of conscience, if they had a feeling, an emotional state, let's say, or a voice that informed them when they had done something ethically wrong and that perhaps made them guilty as a consequence. And it was essentially a universal experience. And that's the voice of society within, I suppose. That's one way of thinking about it. The Freudians would think about that as the voice of the superego. Carl Jung would take that conceptualization somewhat farther. He would have considered it the voice of the self, which is in part the voice of the ethic that's derived from the broader community, insofar as that ethic is valid, let's say, but also in part the voice of the more thoroughly developed self that's still striving to be born. One thing you could say is that you experience violations of your conscience when you're not acting like the better person that you could possibly become. And so, to some degree, that's your higher self upbraiding you for failure to develop in the appropriate direction. And that seems to me to be a reasonable way of conceptualizing it. Now, the one question might be, how error-prone is your conscience, given that you're not omniscient? You have to attend to your guilt and your self-disgust and your self-contempt and your self-consciousness. You have to understand that the manifestation of those emotions might well indicate a moral failing on your part or a lack that needs to be addressed, while at the same time considering that it is not a straightforward matter to deal fairly with yourself, and you can be too tormented by your conscience, too rigid, too responsible, take on too much weight onto yourself, deny yourself in a manner that isn't sustainable, and so forth, that a moral code, a moral way of being can become too rigid and inflexible, and despite its putative aim upward, be something counterproductive. I think most of the way out of that, if there is one, is, well, careful thinking. You have to see what your conscience says. You have to see how you respond. You have to capture that voice and your responses, and you have to think it through. But most of that is done in dialogue with other people rather than as the consequence of internal thought. You know, if you have a dispute with your wife or your husband, your intimate partner, sibling, your parents, anybody close to you, and it's useful for each of you in the dispute to ask yourself and the other person very seriously if you're at fault or if they're at fault, and for both of you to be able to contemplate that you might be at fault and so might the other person, and that it's in your best interest to sort out exactly who's made the error and where, and maybe it's both of you and maybe at different levels of analysis. I think the same might be said about your reaction to your conscience. It's not uncommon for me to talk to my wife, my kids, my parents, my friends for that matter, about something I might be feeling. Maybe I'm guilty about something, I'm self-conscious about something, I'm angry about something. I feel impelled by my conscience to do something as a consequence, to change something. It's very helpful to discuss such things with other people, to say, look, here's what I think I did wrong, and here's how I'm punishing myself, but I'm not sure that I'm not doing it in an exaggerated way. And you gather other people's opinions and listen to them carefully, and friends are extraordinarily useful in that regard. And that can help you calibrate it. So I think most of what we do to decide if our inner voice is healthy is discuss it with other people. And I believe, as I pointed out in my last book, explicitly, that tremendous amount of our sanity is maintained as a consequence of social interaction. So you can't find your authentic self merely as a consequence of a journey within, I would say. You're not, there's just not enough of you. You have to be informed by the broader social world. What is the best way to avoid falling back into nihilistic behaviors and thinking? Well, a large part of that, I would say, is habit. The maintenance, the development, maintenance of good practices, habits. If you find yourself dissolute, neurotic, if your thought tends in the nihilistic direction and you tend to fall apart, organizing your life across multiple dimensions is a good antidote. It's not exactly thinking. Do you have an intimate relationship? If not, well, probably you could use one. Do you have contact with close family members, siblings or children or parents, or people who are even more distantly related? If not, you probably need that. Do you see your friends a couple of times a week and do something social with them? Do you have a way of productively using your time outside of employment? Are you employed? Do you have a good job, or at least a job that is practically sufficient and that enables you to work with people who you like working with, even if the job itself is mundane or repetitive or difficult? Sometimes the relationships that you establish in an employment situation like that can make the job worthwhile. Have you regulated your response to temptations, pornography, alcohol abuse, drug abuse? Is that under control? I would say differentiate the problem. There's multiple dimensions of attainment, ambition, pleasure, responsibility, all of that make up a life. And to the degree that it's possible, you want to optimize your functioning on as many of those dimensions as possible. Those are all the questions that I would decompose the problem into. The best way to avoid falling back into nihilistic behaviors and thinking.